requesting Alisha to come on and introduce the next debate and the panel.
So, for those of you who may be wondering exactly, apart from being a journalist, what are the other ways you can engage communities as artists, as photographers? That's exactly what we'll be talking about for the next hour. We have 4 artists, photographers, community activists telling us how, in this time, they are managing to do what they do. And I'm moderating the panel today on community engagement, taking photography beyond photographers. I run a very new project called the Kashmir Photo Collective. We archive family and studio collections in the Kashmir Valley, along with collecting oral histories. We hope to have enough collections in the next few years to present an older and more intimate view of Kashmir. But there are specific communities that we would like to engage with this work. For example, the Kashmiri youth, for many of whom history begins in 1989, who have no memory of a Kashmir before the conflict, the wider Kashmiri diaspora, and a large Indian audience for whom Kashmir represents simply war and tourism. But as someone who's running a very new project, as someone else in the audience asked, how exactly do we do this? How do we get different kinds of communities engaged in our work? And when one is working with the visual medium, is it part of our role and responsibility to engage the community? Can photography be useful at all in building, sustaining, and engaging dialogue within communities? We have brought together 4 people who have managed to come up with innovative new ways, not only to engage communities, but to address various kinds of issues within journalism, within art, and within the wider world of social and political problems in which we all have to live today. So, over the course of the next hour with them, we will try and break down how they have done this. Let me introduce them and their work briefly before we jump into the debate. Radcliffe Roye, or Ruddy Roye, as he is more popularly known, is a documentary photographer from Brooklyn with over 12 years of experience in the field, both in his hometown of Jamaica and across the USA. He is joining us today straight off the plane from Ethiopia, where he was doing a photography workshop. In 2012, the death of Trayvon Martin, an African-American teenager from Miami, who was killed in Sanford, Florida, set off a series of protests across the United States against the indiscriminate and serial killing of the black community. Each subsequent killing has drawn larger and larger numbers of people into the movement to stop unprovoked police violence against the historically oppressed African American community. Roye embedded himself in these movements and began posting photos on Instagram with accompanying Insta essays, voices from the ground, from the people he was meeting, and sought to change the widespread perception of African Americans as armed and dangerous. Over the last 3 years, he has built a huge personal following, one that goes beyond the mainstream media, and engaged in a daily debate around these contentious issues. We'll briefly take you a very small sampling of his work. Our next panelist is Stalin K, a media and human rights activist with decades of experience in pioneering new models of community media. He is a teacher, a trainer, and an internationally acclaimed documentary filmmaker. He is one of India's leading exponents of community radio and the founder of Video Volunteers. Video Volunteers empowers marginalized communities in media dark zones across India to use video reportage to cover their own unheard stories, to learn how to take action and devise solutions to the pressing issues in their own communities. Video Volunteers distributes these stories from the ground through their website and network of partnerships, trying to draw the attention of our quite schizophrenic media, as we heard in the last panel, towards important stories on the ground. Just a little look into how they do this. They have training sessions in various rural communities. And those videos and films are screened within the community themselves also. Next up, we have Tara Bedi, who is a filmmaker, content and communications consultant. After having worked in the more conventional film and multimedia space for the last 5 years, she has now switched gears towards projects that are far more journalistic and deal with newer forms of dissemination. She is the editor-curator of the Nepal Photo Project and helps manage the India Photo Project. For those of you who may not have seen Nepal Photo Project in the media during the earthquake, it was started with the intention of aggregating scattered content covering the aftermath of the earthquake that devastated Nepal on April 25th, 2015. It is primarily powered by Instagram and has a corresponding Facebook page which links to various resources like credible funding campaigns, volunteer opportunities, news updates, crisis reporting platforms. It started as a team of 6 friends and colleagues, but resulted ultimately in a stream of over 70 professional photographers, volunteers, and citizens of Nepal who picked up their phones and gave the world a real-time window into what was happening on the ground. Rather than giving a macro and editorialized view, they decided to look inwards, and through the stories and personal accounts of their contributors, they began to piece together a very crucial moment in the narrative of Nepal. Now, I don't know if you can read this, but we've tried to pull out some of the actual connections that they were able to make over a platform like Instagram, with Nepali families who were looking for information, with people who were looking to support various villages and communities. But Tara will tell us more about that as well. Finally, we have Samar Singh Jodha, who is an artist working extensively with photography, but is particularly renowned for his public art installations. He has worked on issues of development and traveled and worked across conflict zones in Asia and Africa for the past 20 years. In 2012, for example, he worked with Amnesty International to create a 40-foot media installation at the site of the London Olympics, representing the extent of the ongoing devastation caused by the Bhopal gas disaster, the world's largest or the world's worst industrial disaster, for which Dow Chemical, who is a major sponsor of the Olympics, is yet to take full responsibility. His 2 other major projects, which we'll be discussing today, one is called Express and Aspire. These are photography workshops conducted with children in conflict and marginalized communities in Asia and Africa. The other is a project which Samar has been continuing now for almost 2 decades in a community called Pannel in the northeast of India. He first came across members of the Thai Phake Buddhist tribe over a dozen years ago when he was driving along the Stillwell Road, which leads from southwest China into India's northeast. Apart from creating a portrait project which has documented each of the people living within this tribe that is now down to only about 1,500 people because of various factors, he has also self-funded a project for the rebuilding of a monastery, for the building of an ecotourism site, as well as to bring other forms of textile that used to exist in the community back into place. So I would like to now invite all 4 of these very esteemed panelists on stage. And in the spirit of community engagement, we're going to have the lights on so we can see everyone. If you want to ask a very pressing question while the panel is ongoing, raise your hand. If I think we're in the middle of quite a heated debate between the panelists, I won't take the question, but if I think that, it would be great to have a voice from the audience, then I will take your question even if it's in the middle of the panel. So just please go ahead and raise your hands. We would like to hear from as many people as possible. So the question I wanted to begin with to each of you is, what is community engagement for you?
Thanks, yeah. For me, community is more about, photography, I believe, I've been at it for past 20 years, and that's default. I can, you can wake me at 3 in the morning, I can take pictures. That's how it is today. What I believe is the issues I work with, how I engage with those issues, going beyond just documenting and bringing it to the world. I believe more into capacity building and sustainability issues, where how your art or your photography is going to impact the larger lives there.
As someone who's not a photographer or a journalist, community engagement is about having people like myself and a lot more actually interact with what's going on and actually have a direct and open channel of communication outside of these larger media structures that we live in, and have it completely unregulated in that sense.
Can you give an example from when you were administrating the Nepal photo project during the earthquake?
So one of the most exciting things that happened with Nepal Photo Project was, and it's a primarily Instagram-powered feed. We just thought it's the most kind of user-friendly and intuitive way to do it, is that you actually had people liking, sharing, commenting, and engaging in dialogue with not just the material, but also the creators of that material. And I won't call them photographers because a very large portion of people contributing to that feed were not photographers. So in the instance of one photograph that we shared of a man who had 1,000 rupees in his pocket and needed to fund, medical aid for his wife and had to carry her up and down hills and whatnot. We put up a post, we shared his contact information, and through that we were actually able to raise about 40,000 rupees that we then gave to him. And that wouldn't have happened if you had to go through, let's say, a news agency that was publishing that image, versus when you have Instagram or something like Facebook, where you can actually just directly interact with the people putting the content out and creating it.
Community involvement. Community involvement for me is listening to what my community asks of me and trying to find a way to bridge that gap. The gap, in my opinion, was the relationship between blacks and whites in America. I found that the iconography or the history of black images over the centuries had created a huge perception that, white folks found it maybe not difficult, but certainly a space that they couldn't overcome. And so every day my Instagram feed is an attempt to introduce who I am or who black folks are to white America. I remember being president of the Black Students Association in my college and thought that meant that I should be, gung-ho about blackness. And as I got older and being a father, I realized that our stories are the same. And if I listen carefully, I can tap into those things, those sameness, and figure out a way to let you know that who I am and who I'm writing about are your uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters and cousins, only of a different skin tone. And so that's my involvement. My involvement is really just to introduce who I am to the white community.
Okay, so we're all on this mic. It's an interesting question, community engagement. I think the question itself is worth responding to rather than what I think of community engagement. The question presupposes that there is a me and them. It presupposes that I as an individual is entering a foreign alien space called the community, which I don't belong to, but I want to belong to. The question perhaps is also very modern, coming from a nuclear family, modern societies, from the post-Second World War individualism, where I don't have a community of myself. I'm looking out for communities that I can engage with. The question also reeks of classist versus the focused. So if you look at classical forms of performance or classical art forms, there is a performer and the entertained. There's an entertainer and those who are entertained. In the folk traditions, there is no distinction. Everybody entertains themselves usually in a big circle. Now, if this question were put in the folk tradition, then I am the community, I am the engagement. There is no distinction between me and my community. So as much as I'm listening to the community, I'm also listening to myself. And I belong to the latter tradition. I'm not one of those guilty people I'm not one of those people who feel guilty that, I have to behave in a certain way in my community. I own the community as much as the community owns me. I don't suffer from this urban whatever that, I should go into a community and spend time with them to get to know them. So community engagement we don't think about community engagement. We do think about community ownership in the context of what Sainath was saying about the corporatized media and the commercialized media. From that point of view, we think about community ownership and how do we own the content and the pictures and the visuals and the stories that we create.
Ruddy, I'd like to ask you to respond to that because we were having an interesting debate last night over dinner about who has the right to tell a particular kind of story, right? This is a big growing question within academia, and it's come up against a very tense language now that people find it very hard to even discuss this subject. And one of the distinctions we were drawing was that if you know a place, you don't have to be from that place in order to discuss it publicly, in order to tell its story. So even if you are an outsider, you weren't born in that community, maybe you don't speak the language, but you spend the time to get to know their history, to get to know their politics, to get to know their language, perhaps that is where the real question may lie. So what is your experience of this been, Ruddy?
To further expand on what you say, I think we as documentarians have to be a little humble about how we gather information. I'm just coming from Addis, where right now the Chinese have taken over the building, and so it's news to a lot of people. A lot of foreigners are there now telling the story. The Chinese are taking over Africa. The Chinese are taking over Africa. But there are deeper stories. And so one of the things I was trying to tell the students was, you have to tell your own story. You're the one who knows Piazza, Mercata, Casanchez. You know the architecture that was there during the time of the Italians. Where are these people displaced to? Who are these people who are affected? These are not the stories that the mainstream media are going to cover. And so, on one hand, you can look at a Nakwe or Steve McCurry coming into a country and doing beautiful work and doing sensitive work. But do they capture the soul? Do they capture the little nuances? There's stuff about Jamaica that nobody, no foreigner can understand. I'll give an example. I remember I was in college and we were having the same discussion, and a car passed by playing some reggae music, and the two people who are Jamaicans, me and this other dude, we both went. And the other person who has been doing work in Jamaica, the non-Jamaican, didn't move. That's what I mean. There's just certain things that you can't, no matter how sensitive you are, you can't know. You can't know I mean, like, here's another one. What's the most important sound? And this is just my personal observation. What's the most important sound in Arab countries from a child coming up? No, we could go through anthropology, sociology, whatever. But for me, it's this sound. And that's the sound of the water boiling on the stove. It's something a child hears from in vitro. That pot of tea is on the fire all the way up through life. And it's if you don't know, you just don't know. You come there and you might think that this is the car horn just because you've sat down at a cafe and see cars passing, or the chuk-chuk. But it's more. It's not. It's important that there's a liaison between the foreign press and who's on the ground. That there's a shared responsibility, shared byline, shared light in telling these stories.
Samar, as someone who works in many different countries, many different communities, but who's also been engaged with the NGO establishment. And I call it the NGO establishment for a reason, which is one that a lot of journalists and photographers are having to go through these days to access many of the areas. You actually went in on your own to the Northeast as a photographer, but then also set up without having any particular background, in community organizing this movement within the community. So how long did it take to feel comfortable to do something like that? And as someone who's constantly moving in and out of spaces, what do you think the role of time really is, physically being in a place before you feel ready to do something like that?
Well, I think a lot of us know here that when you walk into an issue in a situation, you are not being dropped by a chopper and there is some guy below who's your handler who's going to take you in a car and go shoot that and you wire that picture and you're done with. That's a very different business. That's purely photojournalism. When you work with communities, I think the most critical part, which we all know, and we spoke earlier about dignity, respect, their time, and you don't pull out your, firing away your cameras. And me working with this community in Northeast, there are about 1,500 of them left now. So one village I've been with since, about 13 years now. It was very fascinating for anybody to find this, it's very sexy. You find some community which is dying, it's gonna finish off and let's take pictures and, take it back to New York and do an exhibition out of it and everybody's gonna be falling all over the place like, wow, this thing is going away. But, the problem with photography also, as we know that we're in business of stealing basically, we go and make our careers out of it and, there's superstars and not so many superstars, but the mission is almost the same, So I think it's, to me, it was always very critical that how much of time I would involve and spending time there over a year or so and then, started shooting some digital stuff. Then we built a studio, there's no electricity there. We built up a studio, I managed to drag my 4x5 there, and then we would experiment, I would make prints, I would bring it back. And over a period of time, it got so much more into that, okay, let's start doing more documentary, more pictures. Meanwhile, reviving some of the textiles, set up an education program, this ecotourism project, some reforestry. So you were basically becoming part of that furniture, which is what every creative person want to be, especially photographers, because you do not want to be, like you mentioned, you don't want to sound like you are an outsider, which is always a battle because you are an outsider no matter what, because you'll never have the pulse of that place, what you just mentioned. So I think it's just giving time is really critical, and it's not about the money because finally in smaller places, all they care about is time. What time do you put in there? It's not about you're going to come with goodies and you're going to start distributing, candies or something. And that's been the approach,
Tara, when Nepal Photo Project came up, it had to be operated from India because of obviously the internet connection, the ability to get stories out from the ground was quite difficult from Kathmandu itself. But what is sort of the future hope, right? There was a crisis, this community came together, you had a very effective stream going out into the media all over the world. But my fear and with projects that are on Instagram, Facebook, that come up within the digital space is that how do they, once that crisis moment is over, once that peak is reached and the attention moves elsewhere, how do you keep going for the future in the digital space?
That's something definitely that we're struggling with, because we did peak and we hit 65,000 followers, and now we're back at 58, which is always sad to see when you see one less 100 following. But it's tricky. I mean, what I hope has happened with Nepal Photo Project and this hashtag that we created that went viral, that got people to actually start contributing to the feed, is that we've created a place for people to actually come and put their own material. So the future actually lies with the people who want it to happen, and we would like for it to not, I mean, I don't like to use the word watchdog, but like, for example, there's a very clear shift from, you know, earthquake-stricken Nepal to now Nepal that has no resources because, you know, the borders are blocked and fuel shortages and electricity shortages. So it would be fantastic if people actually got together and said, you know what, you have this platform called Nepal Photo Project, you have this hashtag, you have this ginormous following. Why not use it to just, you know, put the next narrative in? And I think that's what will be really exciting, along with a visual documentation of a landscape that is at some level now not there anymore, you know. Patan Square doesn't exist. That's the most iconic visual you have of Nepal, but it doesn't exist. So also to document, you know, this changing landscape and what will emerge from it. So that's kind of the hope. I don't know how exactly it's happening yet.
Similar question for you, Ruddy. You've built this major following on Instagram, people who are looking at the stories that you're putting out every single day. What are you hoping for now, or what do you think is the best thing that's happened in this last few years with this particular platform?
I am still baffled by the fact that people in the audience ask questions about, you know, how do we become citizen journalists? There are so many platforms, blogs, Tumblr, the blog, Instagram, Facebook. As the former speaker mentioned, that the 4 or 5 major stories that rocked journalism over the past two years came from social media, came from something that changed the way mainstream media covered the news. The Arab Spring, social media. Black Lives Matter in America right now, social media. I mean, these are stories that mainstream media did not want to touch. And so, for me, my model is to sit in my car every morning, and listen to NPR.
That's National Public Radio in the US.
And find a story that I could use locally. Like I thought about the other day, welfare or the social services was cut by 30% in America, and I wondered how a single mom, my sister used to be a single mom, she now manages a huge bank. So I'm putting that out just in case she hears me using her name she now manages a huge bank, Chase Bank in Manhattan. But for 10 months, when a child was born with difficulties, she had to go on welfare, and it was the most shameful thing for her. But I thought about, you know, they're my sisters, and that's another thing. My photography is really about me and my world. That might sound very narcissistic, but when I struggled as a journalist, I found that if I started to write about stories that were affecting my community, I found that the engagement spiked. When I became commercial and I wrote about, let me see if I can find a nice commercial story. Oh, we're getting a new basketball stadium in Brooklyn. If I talked about the fact that with the erection of this basketball stadium, there were supposed to be some low income houses that have still not been built. Spike went up. So I realized that there's an underclass, and I like that word. I mean, a lot of people don't use the word. There's an underclass of listeners or readers who were on the feed commenting, like they were expecting me to write about this class of people that were not being represented. And so I started to just look for these stories. And that's what I do every day. I engage with people that do not find their stories in mainstream media. And so it's something I do every day. I mean, it's the feed, the number of followers go up according to consistency. The times when I am drained sometimes, and I might find myself lapsing into, again, the commercial stories, because those are easy. You see them on mainstream media. But when I do go out and I am seated in the community, I find that I have a larger reaction to the stories.
Stalin, you also, Video Volunteers is putting out all of these 60, 70 videos a month online. And again, I feel like when we talk about engaging on social media, we have to be aware that there is a difference between doing it in a place like America with digital content and doing it in a place like India where access is not the same. So while the underclass that you're engaging with is actually on these platforms and is at a level of literacy where the debate they're engaging with you and with the other people who are on the platform on a space like Instagram is actually quite far, reaches quite far in terms of the class dimensions as well as following. That may not be the case here. And so how do you make sure, or how do you endeavor to get the stories out in a way where in a space like India, it's not just restricted to that same urban elite population?
Well, yes. I mean, the contexts are different. I mean, at the last time I checked the stats, it said about 8% of India is online. And it meant that anybody who checked an email once a month is in that 8%. Now, there are, having said that, about 900 million cell phone subscribers in this country. Now, not all the cell phone subscribers have 3G connections, or not everybody is on smartphones. However, we also know of internet.org by Facebook. They're trying to get internet on 2G phones. So the technology is moving pretty fast. And a lot of things that we represent on this panel and what Sainath does with Pari is also a result of that technology and the digital sort of democracy that's going on. Not with some, not that companies involved in digital technologies are interested in democratization, but they understand that there is in a country like India or China or Brazil or South Africa or most of Africa, the BRICS nation as we call them, the money is in the bottom of the pyramid. So it is imperative for technology companies and camera companies and all that to shrink their technologies, democratize them, make it cheaper. And we are the result of that, and we should not underscore that element. We always had, someone like me who's been practicing community or participatory or whatever with this media thing that we're talking about, democratized media, whether it is written or radio or video, for about 24 years now. I wanted to do India Unheard, which is the program that I run now since now 6 years. But India Unheard was in my head 15 years back. But 15 years back, I could not think of a project where people with cell phone cameras or cameras that look like cell phones in far off places would be able to do this. Today, we can do that. So, when Sainath says they shot this on cell phone, it's not surprising that nobody in the audience said, really, cell phones? No, because that's where we have switched on to, right? So, in spite of that, in the Goa office of Video Volunteers, we manage about 80 Facebook accounts. And that's because out of the 180 community video activists that we have, those many can't even open their Facebook account. They don't know how to open it, forget having access to it. So a large amount of work that they do, the primary work that they do is to make these short 2-minute documentaries or features on video, and they decide the subjects. There's no editorializing of what they should create. And then their first purpose is to show it back to the communities. They each have a tablet or a like clamp top DVD player or a projector. The state offices have projectors, so they hire they take the projector from the office and take it to the communities and show it back to the communities. The most inspiring and the most fun part of the work is to show the videos back to the communities to mobilize them for action. And then there is this rural woman who is in her sari. The block officer or the district officer does not expect her to flip out a Nexus or a Micromax tablet. She plugs her hard drive or the camera into that Nexus and flips. She does that action. Now this action is very rare in rural India. Now, you might flick 50 times a second, but this is still very rare in rural India. So this has a lot of power. So when you're sitting in front of a block officer doing this, saying, "Madam, my water has not been working for 3 days. Look at this. Look at these visuals." And she's not looking at her. She's looking at like, how do you have this technology? I don't have it. And that makes certain things happen. She knows that. So what we're trying to do is bring technology to people who don't have it. But it's a nightmare, I'm telling you. It's a complete nightmare. And all of us who've done presentations, even in TED Talks or wherever else, you know how it fails. Like right now, the projector failed on us. This is off my chest. This is Delhi in IGNCA. Can you imagine what's going on back there? We have Dina, who's from Chhattisgarh. I'm not joking. She climbs a coconut tree to make a call. We have Paul Malto in Jharkhand, who walks down 8 hours. I'm not kidding. He walks down 8 hours a hill, takes a 3-hour bus to courier his DVD to the office in Ranchi. No, not office in Goa, to office in Ranchi. The average time that it takes to turn around a short 2-minute film is 27 days. Where are we talking about? Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, UP, MP, Bihar, West Bengal, Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir, any time there is a strike, all the Facebook, all Twitter is suspended. You can make calls, you cannot use social media. Jammu and Kashmir is extremely alert and active on Facebook and Twitter and other social media because there's no free media. There's absolutely zero cable television in Kashmir. There was one that was killed. There are newspapers, but they have to be approved by the Indian Army or the Indian state. If you take an independent stand, you're gone. So in that scenario, when I'm just going from here straight to Kashmir to train second batch of people. We have 9 Kashmiris from 9 different districts of Kashmiri division, and they have launched something called Kashmir Unheard. It's been a year now. And you see the kind of response on their stories and the kind of response that come to Greater Kashmir or Rising Kashmir. Not that Greater Kashmir or Rising Kashmir does not take up local issues, they do, but to see the response, the interaction, the dialogues between. Now, Kashmiris are 80% literate. So is Nagaland. Nagaland has the highest literacy. So is Meghalaya. So is Kerala. But that does not translate to digital access. Does not translate to freedom of speech, or does not translate to access to platforms that we have. Literacy and technology does not really go hand in hand. Neither in the access part of it, neither in the content part of it. Regarding the question of who has a right to create content, that's an interesting question again. I would say that anybody who's concerned, that concern can come from immediacy, because it's my house is about to be destroyed because a dam is coming up and my village is going to be submerged. That sort of immediate physical concern, or my concern for Sharmila Irom's fast. I don't know Sharmila Irom. I know AFSPA. I know Manipur. I have heard her a few times, and I think her cause has some worth, and that this country should repeal AFSPA. By the way, there's a talk about repealing AFSPA today, 3 o'clock. If somebody's interested.
Armed Forces Special Powers Act.
Right. So if this was happening, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, if this was happening in parts of Manipur or Kashmir, and we have to say, you know what, the Indian Army should actually be tried in civilian courts and not in martial courts for the rapes they do in Kashmir. If I were to say the statement in Kashmir, I would be under AFSPA. That's what AFSPA is. So if I say we have to repeal AFSPA, then who am I what is my concern? I mean, I'm not from Naga. I don't live in Nagaland. I don't live in Manipur. I don't live in Kashmir. The three places that are OFSPA active today. So should I not be concerned? Should I not be talking about that? Who has the right to speak? I mean, we are not just social beings, right? We're also philosophical beings. We're also sensitive. We're not psychopaths. We are concerned about certain things. So why shouldn't I talk about Ethiopia? Why shouldn't I not do a project in Nigeria? I mean, that's...
And Video Volunteers is not just, it started in India and it has its largest base here, but it works outside in several countries outside of India as well.
Right, and we're going to set up in Honduras, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in other places. The reason we're not setting it up, it's all Creative Commons, right? Including our training manuals and the methodologies, nothing is patented. So it's easy for people interested in other places to replicate what we have done. And the last bit about ownership is, I remember a very interesting story. I wouldn't remember the full thing, so I'm not going to retell. But it stands like,
Stalin, can I pause you and
sure,
I just want to bring
yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
other people into the debate. Yeah. One of the things I wonder is, okay, you've built, India Unheard has a particular kind of people who perhaps believe in what you're doing behind it. Similarly with Ruddy, perhaps similarly with Nepal Photo Project. These people who are, I imagine that they would already be invested in these issues in some way or the other. What is the ability to actually reach out to audiences? And this, I think, is the difference sometimes between the mainstream and people who are trying to function outside of the mainstream, is ultimately the mainstream reaches a variety of different audiences, whereas when you build your own audience, perhaps you're also just continually operating in a silo and talking to people who are already invested in these things, who already want to discuss these things. And so are you in some way increasing the divides between communities by saying this is our silo where we discuss this and we discuss this in this certain way? I'm not saying that any of you do this, but this is a real fear. You know, that people start having these conversations inside their own little pockets. And so the cross conversation is left to people who we might not want to leave it to.
Thank you. You know, ego is a huge thing in this life. My role is just to put out light. And yes, it can feel like it's in a silo. But how many people in here know me? Maybe 2%. Here's my point. My point is I was brought here because of the work I'm doing. So I'm not invested in so much in meeting this vast market. I'm invested in the minute steps that I take. And so I keep doing so that I can get this opportunity to sit here and talk to 50 more people. 50 more people will maybe talk about me for 2 more hours. And in those 2 more hours, somebody else might hear and go, yo, we should invite this dude to Korea. So I'm invested in that. I'm invested in the minute steps. Evolution.
But isn't that about you, Ruddy?
Not necessarily.
How is that about the larger issues you're invested in? Because I'm
if
not targeting this toward
sit here,
you.
I can talk about those larger issues. If I am at home, worrying about the larger issues, I won't get here. But if I do what I'm supposed to do, which is to consistently put it out there, I'm not trying to bore another hole to push it out. I'm digging every day, digging. I go find the story, and hopefully through Tumblr, Facebook, Instagram, tweet, I can find 50 people. In those 4 places, I can find 50 more, and those 50 more push the story, and I keep hoping that that's what is happening. But I'm not trying to jump on what mainstream media is doing, or even piggyback on their model.
I'd like to add to that. And also give you a little fun factoid. I've never been to Nepal. And I run Nepal Photo Project.
I was at the earthquake in the middle of it.
You didn't see me
in my
there,
house.
did you? So I think, my investment with Nepal is very kind of ancillary to this entire discussion. But I think a lot of the success of Nepal Photo Project was was kind of embedded in this whole, the kind of not so nice part of social media and the fear of missing out and sharing and wanting to be part of something. And I think what that led to doing when people started seeing that there were people being featured on this, feed that had 50 odd thousand followers, then suddenly, there's a huge jump in the number of new hashtag images that we found. So it's also that desire to want to be represented, with whatever your motivation may be. That's the not so nice part of it. The nice part of it is that people who wouldn't ordinarily engage with this kind of content are engaging with it because
Give me an example of that, Tara.
for me, I quantify that by the number of times something is shared. So there's a picture by Prashant Vishwanathan that got shared some 1,000 or 1,100 times on Facebook. And the reactions to those were like, shit, I didn't know this was happening in Nepal. These are not people who care about Nepal. These are not people who live in Nepal. These are not people who care about the news. But when you see a picture of, a woman who's caressing the head of her cow and like talking her through those last minutes, trying to make sure that this cow that has given her her entire livelihood is now on her way out, it's boom. Ruddy Roye says it best, boom.
What about within the art community, Samar? Because I think you also operate within these major gallery spaces and biennales where, again, even though there's more and more, it seems, political art, has become sexy again. It seems like that's its own silo as well. Do you think within those spaces there is room for a wider public to engage, these very high-profile spaces?
Yeah, I mean, see, I give you the example which we spoke about earlier, which is that Bhopal project. Now, I wasn't there when it happened, the Union Carbide disaster, and some serious photography came out of it. 20 years later, I wanted to create this issue out there. Instead of going to Bhopal and working on more disaster pornography, I thought, let's create an experience which I can take from here into public spaces in around whichever part of the world I want to take this to. So I recreated a 40-foot container of a train journey of that night. And it's a totally sensory experience. You go in there, there are photographs which are of the plant itself. You feel that chill, which used to be, Bhopal used to be much colder that time, unlike now. And there's a sound piece with that. So my engagement is really, taking the experience out there to people. Now you take that experience either through digital social media, or you do it in the art space with, with a 40-foot container. Of course, 40-foot container is a little difficult to roll up and travel with. But, we've taken it around. We took it to the Olympics. It was here at the India Art Fair. We managed to roll in about 200,000 people through it over the last 5-6 years. So it's possible to work with, depending on, what your space is. And going back to the original debate, I think as a photographer, we do have amazing tool to communicate. And how do you do with it is really what it's all about. Because I don't think it's just about personal stuff. I mean, personal, of course, we all want to be famous and movie stars or whatever it is. But I think this tool is so amazing, especially with social media, that you can push issues which unfortunately were not being seen. Today we are talking about so many things in the country, let's say in India. It's not that, Dalits weren't getting crucified and, all this rioting wasn't happening earlier. Because of social media, it's become so much more easy to connect to. And I think we are very, very fortunate that we have the skills and the luxury of having both the tool as well as the understanding that we can put it out there,
Stalin, I wanted you to respond to this question of silos because Stalin comes from having worked with several civil society movements, and I at least feel this growing rift between the community that's worked on the ground for a long time, people who are in the grassroots, who have the history of the left in mind, and the language of the youth, the language of power politics. And I wonder how much of it has to do with the fact that we're perhaps now having these two conversations in two completely different spaces, and how do we bridge that?
Well, at first, I completely agree that the bridging is important. I mean, the more polarized communities are, or people are, the more the need for bridging, because bridging is essential, right? Without that, there's no dialogue. Without dialogue, there's no peace and there's no justice. silo is an interesting word. And there's another word for the word silo, which is community. You know, if you say, what is my community? And you say, this is my community. It's a community of interested people in photography. Photographers are interested in photography. That's your silo, that's your community. If you say, my community is the small rice farmers in a place in West Bengal, it's a geographical community, that you could say that's a silo, but you're talking within, you're talking to your own self. Is there not a need to talk within silos? There is. Lateral communications has always been our first thing. We talk amongst within. Some of us have forgotten to do that. And then we talk to our next, the first inside, as a line of sight, line of sight conversations. And then we talk, and silos speak to other silos. Like what Ruddy was saying, there are communities, like this community who does not know us. I mean, there are few people who might know me and here, but you might talk about the work outside. And so that's community of a nature speaking to a community of a different nature who's then connected. You know how Facebook works. Friends of friends of friends. Is there a worth in that? Should we invest in that? Yes, there is a worth in that because that's our medium. We are also, let's not forget, we are also the result of a severe oppression on the access to expression. We are results of that. We had freedom of expression, both in the Indian Constitution and in the United Nations Declaration, coincidentally both under Article 19. But we did not have access to expression. It's only today that my expression is finding voice, because I have access finally. And the digital access, and that's why most discussions and discourses and panels and conferences today around communication or expression or media cannot not mention social media, in spite of the fact that India has very tiny amount on social media, because it has a large potential which is about to unleash. In our work, mainstream media is important because the content is alternate, the perspective is community, but the large number of reach is still with mainstream, and therefore we have to work with CNN, we are working with Al Jazeera, we are working with Doordarshan, we have contracts with 7 Doordarshan Kendras in the country because they have masses of audiences, and we are giving the content. None of them pay. And of course, don't be misled by our name video volunteers. The entire network of 250 people that we are, they're all paid. They're paid because they come from very marginalized communities, socially and economically, so it's unfair to expect them to work for free. The last bit is about the talking to the converted. In the past 20 years or so, I've worked with about 500 social movements. Now, if you take the social movements of just Odisha, which are about 48 to 50 social movements, they're not talking among themselves. You know why? They constitute about 60 to 70% of the whole population. If I say that my content or my artwork or my communication is about the marginalized communities of this country, and that the marginalized communities are talking some way amongst themselves, that's 80% of the population. I mean, you guys must have seen the latest surveys about how 5%, 1% hold 50% of assets in India. That's the silo. But we have by mistake called that the mainstream. That's not the mainstream. That's the absolute side stream. Some very important people sit in that side stream. And that's why we have the audacity to call that the mainstream. No, people still sing and dance in this country, which is called folk. We only come to know of that when 9 days of Navratri happens in Gujarat and Bombay. But trust me, as a Gujarati, I can tell you every Sheri does Garbas, even today. And that's still pretty much alive. They may not be on Facebook, but it's still there. So we have this, that's an urban phenomenon, because we're so disconnected with certain realities. And that's okay, it's not bad, right? My submission here is that we should not be afraid of silos, because the silos are problematic if the silos are watertight. And I'm hoping that they're not watertight. In this day and age, how can we be watertight? And if the moment you're on Facebook and Instagram, I'm not on Instagram, I don't understand how it works, but I'm on Facebook, I'm maxed out on Facebook for some reason.
We're going to change the Instagram thing.
Yeah.
And how can anybody be watertight these days, right? At the moment you're on social media, you're not watertight anymore. So I think silos are not an issue. Talking within the converted is not an issue. If the talk remains within that and does not go out, ultimately it has to touch the hearts and chords of those you intend to touch. I mean, this is coming from someone who practices purposive communication, right? I'm not a big fan of art for art's sake. I don't think it exists. Art for art's sake. Because the moment you say arts for art's sake, you said there's a sake. It exists for a purpose, for the purpose of art, right?
So let's,
Before you go any further, this is really what I want to say. Let me make sure I get this together. The fact that he's not on Instagram, and I'm saying this just for argument, makes me angry. Just for argument's sake. I'm angry because I need his stories. For me to grow as a human first, I need his stories. That is the reason why I write these stories, because I know that there's people out there that need to know how Mr. Joe lives, so that they can look in the mirror and go, I'm not alone, because Ruddy just wrote about Mr. Joe. So I'm saying, brother, I need your stories, because there's a puzzle. I grew up thinking that every human being in here has a puzzle that I need. For my life to be better, you're holding on to something that I need, and I get angry that you're not giving it to me. And if social media is that, and I'm telling you, I jumped into social media when I realized that I could just get rid of all the editors. I could just like, that's the reason I'm there. And so I'm spitting this out. You guys have a piece of puzzle I need, and I need it.
So Ruddy needs it, guys. Time for questions. We need to get out of the on the stage silo into the everyone in the room silo.
Hi.
Tell us your name, please.
Hi, I'm Myra. I wanted to talk about the entire discussion or debate that goes on these days about the information that is given by media or journalists, and how it's not always correct information. Even if it's correct, a lot of matters are forgotten about, especially in a country like India, where you have so many various issues that can be covered. But when the Digital India campaign came up, a lot of the other problems were put aside, and suddenly on Facebook, everyone got so carried away by just changing their profile pictures to the tri-colored picture. Or when you're on Instagram and you're doing really well, you have a lot of followers, it's a natural tendency to get carried away by just increasing the number of followers you have and actually forgetting that the stories you're actually sharing with people. So what do you suggest for that? Because I mean, there are a lot of other journalists and a lot of other, I agree with you that photographers being talented or journalists having, you are able to spread a lot of stories, but what about getting media not giving the right information or forgetting important information which is being left behind?
I can take a go at the media part. I think you should not be very harsh on mainstream media. They're a bunch of idiots, and they are out pushing propaganda for a certain, as fine art says, for a certain revenue stream. Now, how far can I go to make that revenue happen? Can I lie? Do I lie? Have I ever lied to make money? I'm not saying this for journalists. Anybody. Do I make up stuff? Like, do I say that you use my cream and you get fairer in 6 days? Do I say that? Have I said that ever in my life? Have I bought that lie? If we agree that we live in a propagandist, commercialized, consumerist society where everybody is trying to push their wares, and if you agree that I have the intelligence as a consumer at most times to discern between lie and fact, and sometimes I fall for a piece of ad or fall for a piece of glamour or a piece of aspiration or hope, and I buy something or hoard something that is not really necessary to my existence, that's my human weakness. Let's keep it at that. Let's treat mainstream media for what it is. It's an entertainment channel. I have a sticker on my fridge which says, my comedy channel, Fox News. My news channel, Comedy Central.
To piggyback on what he said, he said, we shouldn't be hard on mainstream media. I would go further and to say there are a lot of idiots on social media too. Because if the idea is to create numbers, then we'll use the numbers as money. That becomes your motivation. I mean, as consumers, which I am a part of that group, I also have to be very careful about where I dip my water up. You would not go to a dirty well, would you? No, you'd go upstream where the water is clearer. So it's our responsibility to find the clear streams, and it's our responsibility as journalists, if we're going to report news, that we do it with the ethics and etiquette of what we've known to be the news. So they're mainstream idiots and they're social media idiots. It's our job to decipher. My father, God rest his soul, told me that there's this beautiful word. It's called nonsense. Our job in life is to chop off N-O-N. That's our job in life. Find a way to chop off N-O-N, and we're good.
Should I take the next one?
Hi, my name is Ashra Goyal. Actually, I'm not a journalist or a photographer, but there's... Sorry?
He doesn't even have one of those yet.
No, yeah. So this is just an observation that I had being a musician, and that I felt as though I study classical music, Western classical music, and I just realized this one thing, that when I'm discussing things with anyone about music, so I'm always limited by my and the person I'm discussing with. We are bound by our knowledge, right? So when we are done with our discussion and we accept or not accept some things, we are still limited in our scope of knowledge. So once I've created something that is already within my scope, and I get it out, so I want someone else to understand what I've done, what I've made, then I just felt that if we would just be humble in understanding what the person is actually, listening, and what am I saying. I'm trying to say that if both the parties are humble and they just say, okay, if I don't understand that, let's just take a step back. I'll try to understand it. If both the parties have that, probably we can move forward way faster. But just saying that, just telling, like, I'm the vice president of my music society, so I just tell my juniors, be humble and try to understand what our president is saying. So, but that doesn't work. So how can I use my art? Because Alisha is actually my sister, and whenever I read or see things that she does, I always feel that her journalism is like art. That's something that I feel. So how can we incorporate, people like trying to, how can we actually show people with the work that we do that please be humble as well when you see it?
Well, first of all, you have to think of yourself as a journalist.
I'll try. I'll definitely try.
Because that word is just a bullshit word. We're all storytellers. You use music to tell that same story. Do you understand the history of what you're playing? Do you understand the language inside of tones? The fact that you're using 8 bars, that's mathematics. Now, you might not think that you're a mathematician, but scales, I mean, like, when you composing in numbers. You never thought of it yourself as a mathematician, did you? A musician who understands what you're playing, understands the stories that you're telling with a decrescendo and a crescendo, where you stop in a bar where you follow the DCL coda and go back to the beginning. Those are storytelling crafts. See, I mean, the word journalism is a bullshit word. Somebody used it as to create a title. We're all storytellers. We're all griots. That's our craft. So first of all, you have to get to the point that that's what I'm doing. And then you'll see the commonality between all the things that we're doing.
Just one thing I'd like to add there in terms of how do you get that humility across, right? Now, say we have someone here who knows the issues on the ground, worked with 500 social movements, someone who's been in the photography field for a long time, someone who knows social media, someone who knows the art world. They could all be operating at a level of discourse which only photographers understand, or only the activists who've been in the movement for a long time understand. But Ruddy, when he posts a picture on Instagram, the reason I used Teru's term Insta essay is, even if you have no idea how to unwind the complexity of that photograph because you haven't studied the history of photography, you've only ever seen pictures on social media, he gives enough information about that moment where he is for anyone to get into that photograph, maybe in a very different way than a photographer would, right? Similarly, why was Nepal photo project different from, or why did it come about after something like Kashmir, right? Where when the floods happened in Kashmir, there was a lot of information on social media, but it wasn't organized. It took almost a week for it to get organized and people to actually start posting images or videos with correct content. Now, we are lucky that one of the founders of the Nepal Photo Project, or we are unlucky, was also involved in Kashmir. So the day the earthquake happened, one of the reasons they wanted this platform, that with the photographs, it wasn't just about getting the emotional money out of the photographs. There was comprehensive information. This is where we are, this is the person who's on the ground, this is their phone number, so that photograph became immediately usable as information for anyone, no matter whether or not they cared about photography. So similarly, when you have a 40-foot media installation at the Olympic Stadium, people who care about sports, who have no idea what the history of the Bhopal gas disaster is, if you go online and you look at Samar's project, you'll see that all he did was use the simple, hard-hitting statistics of the Bhopal gas disaster outside that entire installation. Anyone reads that the amount of methyl isocyanate that came out, the number of people who were killed, that this is it doesn't take someone who's invested in Bhopal to enter that installation, and it's in a public space. So humility also comes from not just putting yourself in a place where no one can reach you. The humility here is coming from the fact, similarly with Stalin, video volunteers, all of the videos are translated. You don't have to speak that language from that particular community to hear this story from a place you've never been to. They didn't have to do that, but they have done it to let the leaks happen as much as possible, right? So when you are working, I would say when anyone is working on their art, if you don't leave room for that leaking to happen, that's when you are not leaving room for humility either on your side or the other side.
This question is for Stalin. You said something to the effect of art for art's sake is bullshit. So I just want to understand that correctly before I react or respond to you.
Yes, I did.
I just felt like you just took away 30% of my existence because sometimes I like to go there.
Oh.
So I just want to make sure we
So
can talk
that-
later.
That's my answer. That's my answer.
You gotta tell me.
That's my answer.
I wanna know.
I often come across people in the art space who very sort of, let me give you a good example. I was in Kerala in a screening. The guy comes up to me and gives me a visiting card. Now this can happen in Kerala quite a bit. Gives me a visiting card. The visiting card has one line on it which says Arum Allatavan. Which in Malayalam means the one who's no one. The one who is a no one. I take the card, look at it, and said, so why did you print it? Like if you're a nobody, why have a card? Now, there are several people who want to say that I don't care what my response is. I don't care what you think about this. This is what I feel to do. But that's your purpose. It's you've just defined your purpose by saying, I feel like drawing this. That's a purpose. I'm sort of philosophically challenging the purposelessness. How can you be purposelessness? I mean, how can you be in that space? I mean, unless you've become so zen, then you're probably sitting on some mountaintop meditating, not doing anything. I understand, I meditate, and I want to be in that state of nothingness. And I've probably arrived that in momentary basis, like where the thought sort of ceases, you're not thinking about anything. But that's when you're not doing it. Like, that's a whole different purpose. So if you say art for art's sake, there's your sake. You are creating art to promote art, to have an independent thought on art or whatever. I also believe in Bertolt Brecht, which says that everything is political. The fact that you decided not to take a stand, or the fact that you decided to share digital India news much more than the Odisha farmer suicide, that's your position. And you made it clear. So I don't think there's anything called apolitical. I mean, you could be apolitical, but you can't be non-political. You know what I'm saying?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Stalin K, a media and human rights activist with decades of experience in pioneering new models of community media. He is a teacher, a trainer, and an internationally acclaimed documentary filmmaker. He is one of India's leading exponents of community radio and the founder of Video Volunteers. Video Volunteers empowers marginalized communities in media dark zones across India to use video reportage to cover their own unheard stories, to learn how to take action and devise solutions to the pressing issues in their own communities. Video Volunteers distributes these stories from the ground through their website and network of partnerships, trying to draw the attention of our quite schizophrenic media, as we heard in the last panel, towards important stories on the ground. Just a little look into how they do this. They have training sessions in various rural communities. And those videos and films are screened within the community themselves also. Next up, we have Tara Bedi, who is a filmmaker, content and communications consultant. After having worked in the more conventional film and multimedia space for the last 5 years, she has now switched gears towards projects that are far more journalistic and deal with newer forms of dissemination. She is the editor-curator of the Nepal Photo Project and helps manage the India Photo Project. For those of you who may not have seen Nepal Photo Project in the media during the earthquake, it was started with the intention of aggregating scattered content covering the aftermath of the earthquake that devastated Nepal on April 25th, 2015. It is primarily powered by Instagram and has a corresponding journalism within art and within the wider world of social and political problems in which we all have to live today. So over the course of the next hour with them, we will try and break down how they have done this. Let me introduce them and their work briefly before we jump into the debate. Radcliffe Roye, or Ruddy Roye, as he is more popularly known, is a documentary photographer from Brooklyn with over 12 years of experience in the field, both in his hometown of Jamaica and across the USA. He is joining us today straight off the plane from Ethiopia, where he was doing a photography workshop. In 2012, the death of Trayvon Martin, an African-American teenager from Miami, who was killed in Sanford, Florida, set off a series of protests across the United States against the indiscriminate and serial killing of the black community. Each subsequent killing has drawn larger and larger numbers of people into the movement to stop unprovoked police violence against the historically oppressed African American community. Roye embedded himself in these movements and began posting photos on Instagram with accompanying Insta essays, voices from the ground, from the people he was meeting, and sought to change the widespread perception of African Americans as armed and dangerous. Over the last 3 years, he has built a huge personal following, one that goes beyond the mainstream media, and engaged in a daily debate around these contentious issues. I will briefly take you a very small sampling of his work. In the northeast of India. He first came across members of the Thai Phake Buddhist tribe over a dozen years ago when he was driving along the Stillwell Road, which leads from southwest China into India's northeast. Apart from creating a portrait project which has documented each of the people living within this tribe that is now down to only about 1,500 people because of various factors, he has also self-funded a project for the rebuilding of a monastery, for the building of an ecotourism site, as well as to bring other forms of textile that used to exist in the community back into place. So I would like to now invite all 4 of these very esteemed panelists on stage. And in the spirit of community engagement, we're going to have the lights on so we can see everyone. If you want to ask a very pressing question while the panel is ongoing, raise your hand. If I think we're in the middle of quite a heated debate between the panelists, I won't take the question, but if I think that, it would be great to have a voice from the audience, then I will take your question even if it's in the middle of the panel. So just please go ahead and raise your hands. We would like to hear from as many people as possible. So the question I wanted to begin with to each of you is, what is community engagement for you?
Thanks, yeah. For me, community is more about, photography, I believe, I've been at it for past 20 years, and that's default. I can, you can wake me at 3 in the morning, I can take pictures. That's how it is today. What I believe is the issues I work with, how I engage with those issues, going beyond just documenting and bringing it to the world. I believe more into capacity building and sustainability issues, where how your art or your photography is going to impact the larger lives there.
As someone who's
Requesting Alisha to come on and introduce the next debate and the panel.
So, for those of you who may be wondering exactly, apart from being a journalist, what are the other ways you can engage communities as artists, as photographers? That's exactly what we'll be talking about for the next hour. We have 4 artists, photographers, community activists telling us how, in this time, they are managing to do what they do. And I'm moderating the panel today on community engagement, taking photography beyond photographers. I run a very new project called the Kashmir Photo Collective. We archive family and studio collections in the Kashmir Valley, along with collecting oral histories. We hope to have enough collections in the next few years to present an older and more intimate view of Kashmir. But there are specific communities that we would like to engage with this work. For example, the Kashmiri youth, for many of whom history begins in 1989, who have no memory of a Kashmir before the conflict, the wider Kashmiri diaspora, and a large Indian audience for whom Kashmir represents simply war and tourism. But as someone who's running a very new project, as someone else in the audience asked, how exactly do we do this? How do we get different kinds of communities engaged in our work? And when one is working with the visual medium, is it part of our role and responsibility to engage the community? Can photography be useful at all in building, sustaining, and engaging dialogue within communities? We have brought together 4 people who have managed to come up with innovative new ways, not only to engage communities, but to address various kinds of issues within Facebook page, which links to various resources like credible funding campaigns, volunteer opportunities, news updates, crisis reporting platforms. It started as a team of 6 friends and colleagues, but resulted ultimately in a stream of over 70 professional photographers, volunteers, and citizens of Nepal who picked up their phones and gave the world a real-time window into what was happening on the ground. Rather than giving a macro and editorialized view, they decided to look inwards, and through the stories and personal accounts of their contributors, they began to piece together a very crucial moment in the narrative of Nepal. Now, I don't know if you can read this, but we've tried to pull out some of the actual connections that they were able to make over a platform like Instagram, with Nepali families who were looking for information, with people who were looking to support various villages and communities. But Tara will tell us more about that as well. Finally, we have Samar Singh Jodha, who is an artist working extensively with photography, but is particularly renowned for his public art installations. He has worked on issues of development and traveled and worked across conflict zones in Asia and Africa for the past 20 years. In 2012, for example, he worked with Amnesty International to create a 40-foot media installation at the site of the London Olympics, representing the extent of the ongoing devastation caused by the Bhopal gas disaster, the world's largest, or the world's worst industrial disaster, for which Dow Chemical, who is a major sponsor of the Olympics, is yet to take full responsibility. His 2 other major projects, which we'll be discussing today, one is called Express and Aspire. These are photography workshops conducted with children in conflict and marginalized communities in Asia and Africa. The other is a project which Samar has been continuing now for almost 2 decades in a community called Penang in the north.